The big story for today is someone blew up the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, the US is sending new weapons to Ukraine. More food suppliers and logistics companies are warning of problems for Europe. And the saga of Ray Epps and January 6th continues. I have that and more in your Intel brief for September 27th, 2022. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, which typically carry natural gas from Russia to Europe, have developed three leaks in sections spanning under the Baltic Sea. Flows through the pipelines have been virtually non existent since Russia shut off gas flows to Europe in retaliation for European sanctions. The pipelines are nearly 50 miles apart, so natural causes are ruled out at this point. Someone deliberately blew them up. And that's not an easy task either. The walls of each pipeline are over an inch and a half thick, and the pipes are encased in concrete. Whoever did it would need a significant amount of explosives and be able to place them on a pipeline which is over 300 feet underwater in some places. Now, I'm still trying to determine how deep underwater these specific sections were that were hit. I don't have an answer for that yet. It's not clear how long it's going to take to repair the pipeline or if it can even be repaired at this point. But now Europe is really in trouble. If the pipeline is not fixed soon, Europe is not going to be able to negotiate with Russia to restart natural gas supplies for the winter, which they desperately need. There's much more to talk about, including likely perpetrators of the sabotage, so I plan on releasing a more detailed analysis later this week when hopefully we have some more updates on this too, so stay tuned. The US sent new longer range surface to air missile systems to Ukraine. So Russia's mobilizing its reserve forces. Meanwhile, the US is sending more powerful weapon systems to Ukraine. The Nord Stream pipeline has been blown up. The conflict is escalating and shows no signs of stopping anytime soon, even though for a period there we had the media looking like they were turning on the narrative. You had the media reporting on a lot more negative stories about Ukraine, which indicates there seems to be some infighting possibly behind the scenes, or at least someone's trying to plan an exit strategy so they could say, well, we have to stop supporting Ukraine because look how corrupt they are. They're not getting the weapons we're sending, etc., etc. That narrative seems to be crafted, but still we're continuing to support Ukraine and escalating this conflict with Russia. And at this point, one miscalculation by either side could turn this regional conflict into a world war, which is the big danger with this sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. We don't know for sure who did it yet. I have my suspicions personally, and I don't think Russia's the number one culprit. But this Nord Stream blowup could certainly be considered an act of war by Russia. It's not good. And it seems some U.S. leaders are betting on that. A large scale conflict with Russia would be a great distraction from domestic issues and give the American government many new excuses to target political opponents. Australia is aiming for a stable relationship with China despite differences, especially on trade, Australia's foreign minister said, as she called on Beijing to use its influence as a great power to help end the war in Ukraine. Australia's ties with its largest trading partner are at a low after disputes over a number of issues, including the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, trade, and Australian accusations of Chinese interference. Watch how quickly former U.S. allies cozy up to China as the unipolar world order is challenged. And what if Europeans blame the United States for the Nord Stream sabotage, whether or not it's actually true? The U.S. had several reasons to blow up that pipeline, including forcing the EU to maintain Russian sanctions and escalating the conflict with Russia. That may drive Europeans away from the US in favor of this competing world order between Russia, China, and other players. We may find ourselves quite lonely very soon. German frozen food suppliers and refrigerated food logistics companies are warning significant food supply issues are coming. Many producers and transportation companies cannot afford to continue operating with skyrocketing energy prices across Europe. Here's a direct quote. The financial standing of food producers is deteriorating every day, which could soon result in a wave of bankruptcies in the industry. They warn that government intervention is needed to salvage this situation. In particular, they are calling for financial support for energy intensive, medium sized producers in the deep freeze chain. I've been waiting to hear more before increasing the famine risk for Europe, which is now assessed as moderate. And you can see on the map, all these European countries are now in the orange. Between the warnings coming out of European industry and the Nord Stream sabotage, Europe's food supply is in serious trouble. Winter producers are already shutting down operations. Frozen food suppliers are considering cutbacks. Refrigerated food transportation and warehousing companies are facing insolvency. If these companies shut down, Europe's only going to have access to dry goods and some limited fresh foods. Food prices will skyrocket, and a substantial portion of the population are not going to be able to afford it. So, what happens in Europe when, say, double digit percentages of the population can't afford to feed their families? Well, mass rioting, looting, social unrest, and extreme violence, most likely. It's not going to be pretty. It took a while, but the truckers won. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reportedly signed off on dropping the border COVID-19 vaccine mandate at the center of weeks of the truckers' protest and subsequent government crackdown in the country's capital city of Ottawa earlier this year. The Canadian government announced on Monday that it will not be renewing the order that expires on September 30th and therefore will remove all COVID-19 border requirements for all travelers entering Canada. That includes the removal of all federal testing, quarantine, and isolation requirements, as well as the mandatory submission of health information. This is a big win for Canada, and I was getting really worried for a while there because it was going in a pretty bad direction. But we're seeing major changes happen in Canada pretty fast. Populist movements are growing worldwide, but especially in Canada. And this just shows you the power of populism and how leaders, well, if they're sane leaders realize that populist uprisings can be a very big problem for them. And ultimately, leadership typically doesn't win against a populist uprising, so they kind of have to placate them. Otherwise, they face being overthrown, potentially in a violent revolution if it comes to that. So you're seeing a lot of these European leaders, as much as they don't like populists, as much as they don't like a lot of their own citizens, realizing that they kind of have to get along with them or at least placate them or get out of the way. Otherwise, it could get very ugly. According to records between September 2020 and April 2021, postal inspectors spied on protests, including through a covert social media surveillance program dubbed the Internet Covert Operations Program, abbreviated ICOP. The inspectors spied on conservative groups that marched to D.C. following President Biden's election, protests in Louisville, Kentucky, following an investigation into the death of Breonna Taylor at the hands of the police, and gun rights activists in Richmond, Virginia. So some other news. University of Utah Police Department arrested a student for making a joke about a nuclear reactor and the university's football team on the social media platform Yik Yak, which allows students to communicate without revealing their names. Meredith Miller posted, "If we don't win today, I'm detonating the nuclear reactor on campus." Obviously a joke. The police traced the post back to Miller, arrested her, and booked her into the Salt Lake County jail, rather. She was released on a $5,000 bail and is facing a charge of making a terroristic threat. So this type of redefinition of what is considered an illegal threat is going to be used to target political dissidents. I talked about this a bit in the last brief about engineering pretexts for a crackdown. Reinterpreting jokes or free speech as true threats is a tactic that will be expanded upon. So while this case particularly has nothing to do with politics, the precedent here is set and will be abused to target political enemies. An FBI whistleblower recently came forward and issued warnings about alleged politicization at the FBI, saying that the Bureau is spying on law-abiding Americans and that many of its domestic counterterrorism cases are tantamount to entrapment. Kyle Seraphin, who has spent 6 years in the FBI, was suspended without pay and cannot seek another job without quitting or asking for permission. Yeah, really trying to force this guy out. He also says the number of guys who say, I don't agree with what's going on here, but I've got 3 years to retire, it's heartbreaking. So this leaves me with some mixed feelings. At one side of it, I'm happy that people are blowing the whistle on this stuff, that they're exposing it, that there's at least some people not going along with it. But the other side wonders, at what point do you become the Nazi prison camp guard, who may disagree with what is happening, but you continue to voluntarily be part of an organization that is doing this stuff? At what point do you realize I was just going to do my job, or I was just following orders, is not going to be a defense? The populist opposition to the elites is growing. Historically, the populists win against established leadership. And when they win, they will very likely not be kind to anyone who is sympathetic to the old regime. If you are working for the government, especially in a law enforcement or intelligence capacity, it's really time to start thinking about an exit plan. This is from Julie Kelly. Defense attorneys in the Oath Keepers case, which jury selection begins, I think that would be today, file motion opposing the Department of Justice's request to conceal information pertaining to several FBI informants working in the group before, on, and after January 6th. It would be nice if they're successful. I highly doubt they will be. But this just shows you that in a lot of these cases, the FBI is taking steps to protect its informants, to protect people that were involved in January 6th. So we know that there were FBI agents and informants and other types of assets on the ground on January 6th doing things. We don't know specifically what things they were doing and who was doing what, but the government was certainly involved in a lot that happened on January 6th, and they're not talking about it, interestingly enough. I wonder why. Also, we have other news on that front. Democrat Representative Raskin called Ray Epps a poor schmuck who is just trying to survive after he faced questioning from Rep. Massey. So if you don't remember, Ray Epps was captured on video during January 6th, actually on January 5th, the day before, attempting to incite protesters to enter the Capitol multiple times. He has never been charged for any crimes related to January 6th. Meanwhile, protesters who were let into the Capitol by police have faced years in prison over trespassing charges, which is absolute insanity. The FBI has refused to answer questions about their use of confidential informants and undercover agents on January 6th, and they will not say whether or not Epps was working for the Bureau at the time. They also will not explain why Epps, who was initially on the FBI's wanted list for January 6th, was removed from that list. Put yourself in the shoes of a left-winger who buys into the January 6th insurrection narrative. You sincerely believe January 6th was an insurrection attempt on the Capitol that almost destroyed our government. Why in the world would you defend a man who was caught on camera multiple times trying to incite crowds of protesters to go into the Capitol building? And by the way, you can just search for this on YouTube and watch the videos yourself of Ray Epps trying to encourage people to go into the Capitol on January 6th. He was inciting them on January 5th to go into the Capitol the next day. And one of the videos, the crowd even starts chanting, "Fed, Fed, Fed," because they think he's obviously a Fed, because he just walks up to this crowd of people and says, "We need to go into the Capitol tomorrow." Yeah, the truth is you wouldn't. You would want Ray Epps to burn along with everyone else who was involved in January 6th. And that shows you that even some of the left-wing leaders claiming January 6th was a threat to democracy, they don't really believe it. And they know they have to protect government assets like Ray Epps. Otherwise, the truth is going to get exposed. Media, the FBI, and specific politicians are bending over backwards to protect people like Ray Epps while demonizing almost everyone else who was at the Capitol. January 6th was clearly an engineered event. Questions remain, however, into exactly how much and what government agents and proxies did that day. How much of this specifically was engineered, and how much of this involved independent people acting of their own accord. So thank you for watching, guys. I'm going to be changing the format a little bit to release hopefully a bit more videos each week, but make each brief shorter and more friendly to new viewers. I'm still going to be reporting on the same topics. I'm just organizing it a little bit differently. And I also plan to do a faster weekly news wrap-up for those that don't want as much detail and only have interest in the most important stories. So please feed that algorithm for me, and I'll see you next time.